a key mental model unlock for people who are not exposed to crypto to really understand that when you think about money, you can think about moneyness. And you should think about money not just as a noun, but money as an adjective. And
That's
things
right.
can have more moneyness than other things, and it's a spectrum. And
Hmm.
I think that's very important to unlock. And the other aspect that you just unlocked is, and there is a fairly like well-known feature set that make some things better money technology than others,
Hmm.
right? And so like there can be monies that fit, or products or assets, let's say, that fit those criteria, and others that don't. And those that fit that criteria are more likely to have a higher moneyness over time. But
Hmm.
I want to ask a question before we get into the story of the bull case for Bitcoin and like why Bitcoin. And maybe the last question is, why do we even care to think about this? Because one possible answer to the what is money question is probably the normie answer. What, 95% of Americans, how 95% of Americans would answer that question. Maybe folks around the world, what is money? Dollars.
Hmm.
What are you talking about? What is money? I know I got money in my bank account. It's dollars, Robert. Why are you even talking about this?
Hmm.
And I think the reason we're talking about this, maybe, and I'd like you to frame this, is the crypto believes that there are better money technologies out there than the money technologies that we've invented so far. So that's like the positive framing of this.
Hmm.
Maybe the negative framing of this, I want you to comment on this too, is we also believe that our money system is broken or has some flaws. There are some issues with the existing money system. So to answer the question, why are we talking about this, is because there's something better out there, and because our existing system has flaws. Can you talk about what is broken about the existing money system that we have? And you could frame this in whatever way. What's broken about dollars? What's broken about fiat? What's broken about the setup that we have right now in the 2020s?
Yeah, so let's do kind of just a quick gateway from gold to dollars, because I think that's an important point that many people don't understand. A lot of people still think that the US dollar or other fiat currencies are in some way backed or redeemable for gold, which is not the case. That's the definition of a fiat currency, is that there is no commodity behind it, right? It's just based, that's what the word fiat means, by decree. Use this money because I said so, basically. That's not how dollars originated. So, as we briefly touched on, right, gold was the best tool for the job when it came to money. It best satisfied those five properties of money in a way that once the world was interconnected enough by telecommunication networks that it sort of settled on one protocol standard, which was the gold standard. Gold basically outcompeted all other forms of money to become the dominant money in the world. Now, it operated alongside silver for a while, and that's because gold had a lot of economic value per unit of volume. So it was very impractical to use for day-to-day transactions. So if you're going to buy a cup of coffee, for instance, you would be transacting in something like gold dust, which would be difficult to put in your wallet and not lose. So we needed like a transactional currency for small day-to-day purchases, which silver filled the role for, and gold was used for larger transactions, right? Like larger settlements, buying a house, etc. Now, the reason, I guess, where gold and monetary metals in general were weak in terms of those five properties, the one area where they're specifically weak is portability. So if you want to move money across space, monetary metals work, right? We can secure them, you can transport them, you can put them on a boat, etc. But all of these processes are expensive, they're high risk, and they don't lend themselves well to an economy that's globalizing, and you're trying to have a higher intensity of exchange, moving money more quickly, trading goods more quickly to produce more wealth. Monetary metals are sort of a hamstringing of that process, if you will, right? The transaction cost related to moving physical metal across the ocean or across the ground, like there's a lot of cost and risk associated with this that we would prefer we didn't have to deal with.
And even
So
just the speed, Robert. I think Lynn Alden has made this point. I mean, what's the fastest you can move money from like the United States, like New York to London, let's say? Probably a plane, right? So we're talking still hours of transaction time.
yes, and that's in the modern age, right? We have to remember that gold monetized over the course of 5,000 years. So,
Right.
in the
Months in a ship.
1800s, yeah, 1700s, 1600s, the plane wasn't even an option. It was by train, by boat, by wagon at one point. So there were severe limitations in terms of portability when it came to monetary metals. So how did we solve this? Well, we figured out that there's an economy of scale to be gained by just centralizing the custody of gold inside of banks. And then these banks that can communicate with each other can just make ledger entries, right? So they can just say, hey, I'm going to dock your account this many ounces of gold and credit the account over here. So you get into this debt-based system. You also get banknotes as a result of this process. So originally, these were just warehousing operations for gold. So you would put your gold on deposit. The warehouse custodian would issue you what was called a warehouse receipt, what we call today banknotes. This was an IOU, right? I have this many ounces of gold on deposit. This paper receipt allows me to redeem that gold at any time. Well, market actors being smart realize, hey, the portability problems with gold, I can now overcome them by just carrying around this gold-backed currency, this warehouse receipt, and I can trade these things as if they're as good as gold, because indeed they are. You can take it to the warehouse at any time and get your gold, right? This introduced counterparty risk into the gold standard. All of a sudden, you now have to trust the custodian not to overissue these pieces of paper in excess of what their gold reserves can justify. So you get into this situation where you've created an incentive trap, basically. A custodian has a huge financial incentive to issue additional sheets of paper. All they have to do is bet that not all their customers are going to come redeem the gold all at once, right? You can start running a fractional reserve. So you can issue paper in excess of gold reserves. And as long as that fraction is not too extreme, right? If it's just 10 or 20% more, and no more, you would say no more than 80% of your customers at any time come to redeem the gold at once, then you're fine. You can run this fraudulent operation and you never get caught, basically. And so you get additional revenue, right? You can engage in lending operations, blah, blah, blah. You can basically print money, right? To whatever the extent your fractional reserve is. So this basically incentive trap manifests itself. This is not to say that all bankers are evil or anything. It's just sort of a natural incentive trap. Even banks that ran honestly, some fractional reserve banks would honestly disclose, hey, we're only going to keep 80% of this on reserve. We're going to create an excess 20%, lend it out, try to generate revenue. We'll give you some yield on it. Right? That was always the carrot to draw in customer deposits. We'll give you some of the yield that we generate, blah, blah, blah. Even the banks that operated honestly, though, would still get targeted by governments eventually. The government would say, oh, well, we're going to war or we're broke or whatever the thing is. How do we raise additional funds? Oh, well, the one throat to choke is the bank over here, right? They have a bunch of customer gold on deposit. We can suspend redeemability. We can loan ourselves some of the customer gold, or we can seize it, right? As we did in Executive Order 6102, 1933 in the US, when private gold holdings were seized and outlawed under threat of imprisonment. So,
true story, by the way. This is FDR who implemented this, and
yes,
he said 1933.
So just, I guess, to maybe get to the point, we put all the gold in one place to overcome the portability shortcoming. That naturally, through the incentive trap, becomes a fractional reserve. And that fractional reserve gets more and more exacerbated over time, either by the bankers themselves or by governments that are commandeering the operation to fund whatever it is they're doing. And they tend to end up on a zero reserve standard, which is what we call fiat currency. So what are dollars? Well, dollars are fiat currency. The dollar used to be redeemable for gold. The dollar went through this entire process to go from being a gold-backed currency, and you can look this up, right? Google what a dollar looked like pre-1930. It says it right there on the face of the dollar. This certificate is redeemable for X units of gold on demand. Well, that became a fractional reserve over time with intermittent interruptions of the redeemability during wartime, as we mentioned with 6102. And then finally in 1971, and we're also skipping over World War II here. We're basically, after the United States won World War II, it held the Bretton Woods Conference. It pegged all international currencies to the dollar. The dollar would be pegged to gold. This peg held for a little less than 30 years, from 1945 to 1971. We had the 1971 Nixon shock. He takes us off the gold standard. And this basically put the entire world indirectly onto a fiat currency standard, a zero reserve standard, which gives the government the ability to print money ad infinitum with no check. No one can call the bluff. No one can redeem the dollars for gold. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is this is a giant fucking pyramid scheme. If one organization can print the money that everyone else is forced to use, you get really ridiculous consequences like limitless government overgrowth, right? The expansion of government deficit spending, right? Where the government's actually producing losses. And if it were any other organization in the world, it would go bankrupt. The capital would be reallocated to higher and better uses. But in the case of a monopolist on the money printer, they just print money to paper over the losses. So you're externalizing the cost of the losses onto people via inflation, and you're continuing to grow this organization that's producing losses.
Robert, you said forced to use, though.
Yeah, legal tender laws.
Okay.
So legal tender laws are one component. You're forced to pay your taxes in dollars. You're forced to accept dollars in settlement of all debts, public and private. Also, when you're inside of the fiat currency system, you're surveyed, right? Your transactions can be frozen, right? If you donated to the Canadian trucker protest or participated in that protest, you saw just how private your property was in those bank accounts. Not only is it not private in that it's surveyed, tracked, traced, it's also not property because it can be seized arbitrarily at any time for any reason, even if you're expressing your peaceful, liberal, democratic right to protest. A country like Canada, which was rated very high on the Liberal Democracy Index, acted very authoritarian in the seizing of those protesters' funds. So the problem is that when you go into a fiat currency paradigm, your property is no longer private property. It's seizable, it's traceable, it's confiscatable. You become a subject of the state. And there's no way to cast the vote of no confidence against the state, because in the past, if a government was printing too much money, people would see that, market actors, and say, okay, this country's printing too much money. They're being irresponsible with monetary policy. Let me sell this currency and redeem it for gold and take my gold into another jurisdiction where there's more responsible monetary policy being carried out. In a fiat paradigm, you don't have that option anymore, right? You're trapped in a system with no opt-out. And what does this make you? I mean, it makes you you're perpetually subject to taxation via inflation forever. So if you hold dollars in a bank account today, your purchasing power is being siphoned away by the central bank, right? Every dollar printed is proof of labor stolen, effectively. So that would be the beginning of the central bank rabbit hole. And on this topic, I would point people to the book that got me started, which is The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. I actually just had him on the show, which was a big honor. We just released that episode. And I think if you listen to his book or read his book, you will come to the same conclusion many of us have, which is that central banking is the primary socioeconomic problem in the world. We have a monetary system built on theft and deception. It's used to fund warfare. It's used to fund mainstream media bullshit propaganda narratives, like keep people confused. It's used to fund the pseudoscience of Keynesian economics in mainstream universities. That is not science. It's just a justification for the state's monopoly on money printing. It obfuscates Austrian economics, which is actual economic science. And so we're dumber, we're more destructive. And we're incentivized to steal and kill from one another in a fiat paradigm. And so I think it's very fundamentally coercive, almost in a spiritual sense.
Mm.
And so that's why I think incorruptible money, or money that cannot be counterfeited at scale, is very important. And that's what physical gold or Bitcoin would be.
A part of this story throughout history definitely is impacted by one of the things you were talking about earlier, Robert, the attributes of money. And I think this division of attributes about money kind of created the conclusion that you just articulated. Silver, for example, is more like the high velocity version of money in comparison to gold. It was like the spending money, the currency money. And then the gold was more of just the low velocity store of value. You hold on to that and you like denominate your savings in it and you spend your silver. And this property about money exists across many different times and contexts. There seems to be like a high velocity and a low velocity version of money, a high spending money, and then the money that you just keep for your savings. When you articulated that like gold has this transportability problem, like it's heavy, it's physical, it can't go over space and time well. And then the banks solved that problem by creating gold banknotes. So actually like silver is just completely forgotten and
That's
replaced by banknotes, which are actually even more transportable and high velocity and spendable than gold. And gold, through this, what you called an incentive trap, finds itself aggregating across banks, these bank institutions. And so more and more gold comes into these vaults, and the banknotes become the high velocity currency, which gives, and the centralization of gold is a target capture by the people with the largest army, the government, which is how we end up in this predicament that you just articulated. The high velocity versus like high value components of money, I think, is something that we still see to this day, even in the crypto world, right? We have Bitcoin and then we have stable coins. This is like the spending currency and then the store of value currency. So I just wanted to like note the parting of these different components of moneyness. One was related to capture. And so when listeners are saying like, oh, money is the dollar, I think it's worth noting, well, actually, that's the money that has been able to have been captured, and it's no longer the low velocity storage money. And this, I think, can account for, since this high velocity money is also the highly printed money, how many trillions of dollars or billions of dollars did we print during COVID? And then also was the rise of the stock market over those last 2 years. I think perhaps the stock market replaced gold as the place in which people have their low velocity store of value. But I think ever since the rise of the fiat currency of the dollar, money as a concept, people have been looking for the replacement to gold, the low velocity savings vehicle of money, the money with the attribute that gold once served, that quote unquote got stolen, got rugged by this paradigm of fiat currency. And so humans have been looking for an alternative to gold to put their savings in, and they've kind of been using the stock market, equities, as a replacement to that. And that's accounted for perhaps one of the greatest wealth bull markets of history over the last 50 years in the stock market. If you control for the rise of the stock market by the inflation of the dollar, it's actually not that bullish. It's actually pretty flat. How would you reflect on this?
No, that's an excellent point. First, I'll start with the silver thing, because you're spot on. Silver was functional alongside gold until we invented gold-backed currencies. Once we augmented the portability of gold via a gold-backed currency, you didn't need this transactional physical metal as much. The need for physical silver was obviated, and the monetary premium of silver collapsed. So that's when gold really became dominant. Once we gathered all the useful monetary properties under one invention, which was the gold-backed currency, it eclipsed silver, essentially. So that's a very important point, that you've heard these arguments like, oh, Litecoin is to Bitcoin what silver is to gold. And it's like, it doesn't hold water, actually, because they both have the portability thing solved, more or less. There's not, in my opinion, a meaningful niche for Litecoin to establish for itself, considering Bitcoin is already a pure digital bearer asset.
And importantly, Bitcoin is divisible down to 8 decimals.
That's right. And you can further that divisibility via soft fork, which is something a lot of people don't realize. If ever it were, say, a cup of coffee were half a sat or something like that, you could actually expand the divisibility of Bitcoin via a backwards compatible software update. It wouldn't be a very contentious thing. Like soft fork is much less contentious than a hard fork, as many of your audience probably know. So it's the divisibility is basically unlimited, right? It will suit. What did Mises say? That the quantity of money is sufficient to suit the needs for any economy, assuming sufficient divisibility. Well, Bitcoin has unlimited divisibility, so that's it. It just works. The other point you hit on there was, the problem with a gold-backed currency. Although you kind of got all the necessary properties of money in one tool, but the problem was the centralization that it introduced. Right, we now needed to centralize the custody of gold inside of bank vaults. And what's a very common definition of money? Money is power. What happens when you concentrate that much power into one place? Right? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the institutions that grew up around these centralized gold hoards, non-coincidentally, in my opinion, happen to be the most corrupt organizations in human history, which are central banks. So the problem with gold, in my opinion, is the physicality, right? Again, we already hit on why portability is a problem that leads to centralization. The other problem with physicality is that it invites violence, right? I don't need to negotiate with you. If I can conquer your country and I can blow up your central bank and take your gold, there's no negotiation that needs to take place. I just need to kill you, blow up the thing, take the gold, and march onward. If you recapitulate that idea on a Bitcoin world where the central bank is holding some or all of its reserves in a Bitcoin multisig, all of a sudden there has to be a negotiation. There can't be this unilateral seizure, right, where they just show up, blow up the central bank, and take the Bitcoin. There has to be some negotiation. So I think non-physical money is inhibitory to violence and coercion, and that it forces a negotiation with the holder. If the holder is holding it properly, right, in a multi-sig, I don't know if you guys talk about multi-sig much or not, but you're basically taking one private key, chopping it into 5, 10, 15, 100, whatever number of shards or pieces, and then you're distributing that out with a trusted circle of individuals, and then you need a quorum, right? You need a simple or a super majority to move funds. So all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to coerce this party of people that you don't even know who they are necessarily. You don't know the protocols. You don't know the safe words, right? If this guy calls at this time and says this word, then shut the whole thing down. There's all this unparalleled security schematic that's possible with non-physical money that is impossible with physical money. So whereas physical money invites violence, I think non-physical money sort of does the opposite, forces the negotiation. And so what is that? You're basically saying with Bitcoin, we have a money that is non-physical, doesn't require centralization to scale, and is not responsive to unilateral confiscation. So that's a big idea to try and start to wrap your head around. The other point I would hit on that you mentioned was, okay, people say, all right, what is money? Oh, money is the dollar. Well, it depends on how you define money. So if we say, yes, okay, the dollar is the most widely accepted asset in the world today. It is the most marketable good, if we want to use that term. But what it's not is a final extinguisher of debt. All right. Now, again, we have legal tender laws. We are compelled by the legal system to accept US dollars for settlement of all debts, public and private. But the weird thing about it is that debt is never actually settled, because there's always a liability attached to a fiat currency. Even if you stuff these dollars under your mattress, you still have counterparty risk in the Federal Reserve. If they print new dollars, they can debase your purchasing power, even of your physical dollars under your mattress. So it's not enough to take physical custody of dollars. You still have an associated liability. It's not a true bearer asset, right? In accounting, assets equals liabilities plus equity. Holding physical gold or holding Bitcoin is holding a 100% equity in the asset, right? My possession of it is indication that I own it free and clear. There's no liability attached to it. But in a dollar or in a fiat currency, there is always a liability component that is expressed in the inflation that asset is subject to. So you could say dollars are money, but they're not fulfilling the role of money perfectly, which leads to the second point you made. Okay, equities. Why have equities been monetizing? If we've compromised the store of value function of dollars, what do market actors do? They naturally start to hold their purchasing power in assets that cannot be counterfeited or arbitrarily debased. So we get a rise in gold, in commodities, right? Oil, black gold. We get a rise in equities. We get a rise in real estate. We get all of these things that aren't meant to be money start to act like a store of value because the currency itself is not functioning as a store of value. Now that's useful to some extent, right? That's market actors adapting to the reality they're inside of, but it's not ideal because all of those asset classes, aside from physical gold, they still have counterparty risk, right? If you own real estate on paper, you have counterparty risk of the government. If you don't pay your property tax, you don't own it. Equities, you have the counterparty risk of the management team, the exchange, also the government, right? If you don't pay your capital gains tax, they'll seize your stock. Commodities, unless you own the physical commodity and you own a paper claim to it, you have counterparty risk in the issuer of that certificate. So all of these things get monetized that aren't money, and this creates distortions in the marketplace. And to your point, I think people are ultimately just seeking the thing that has the least counterparty risk. That's what gold was. That's why its private ownership had to be outlawed in 1933. They needed to force people out of gold into fiat so they could print money. And now that's what Bitcoin is basically perfected, is you can own this digital bearer asset that's non-physical, very hard to confiscate, very easy to anonymize if you're using privacy technology. I wouldn't say easy. Okay, maybe that's an overstatement. Possible to anonymize, depending on your level of sophistication. And so that's why I think it's such a big deal, right? You're just giving people, in 1215, King John signed the Magna Carta, and the principles, this was the philosophical scope of government, was to protect life, liberty, and give people inviolable private property. Well, we never had an implementation of that third ideal. Property has always been at the leisure of the state, but for the first time in history, we have a system that can protect people's property rights independent of the monopoly on violence. And so that's a radical new discovery, right? People around the world, for instance, that haven't had access to a stable or strong currency now have access to Bitcoin. They can preserve purchasing power over time, and they can build themselves economically. So it's a really, really big deal. And I guess that's why so many people are excited about it. It's hard to overstate how big of a deal it really is.
To continue leveling up your crypto game, then you need to get on the Bankless newsletter. It's the world's most popular crypto email and is completely free. Just click below to sign up.